Hi, I'm Jeff Morrow. I'm a professor of Catholic theology at Seton Hall University's Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology. I'm a Jewish convert to Catholicism, and in this lecture series, what I will be talking about is the resurrection of Jesus. The first half will roughly be about my own conversion, how I came to faith in Jesus, and then how I became Catholic. And then the second half of this course, we'll be talking about the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, what led me into the Catholic Church. In this first lecture, we'll start with what my life was like before I met Jesus. I think it might be helpful to tell you a little about my own conversion prior to delving into the historical arguments for the reality of Jesus' resurrection. My own historical investigations into the events surrounding Jesus' resurrection were a central part of my own conversion. Before I explain my conversion, however, I think it would be helpful to go over my own upbringing in early years. My conversion was unexpected for everyone in my family and for all of my friends. For some in my family, however, it seemed that I had completely forsaken my Jewish heritage. My friends from school were utterly bewildered by my conversion. I think a few thought this was just a phase I was passing through, but that I'd come around to my senses at some point. Despite these responses, I have now been Catholic for more than half of my life, and my faith in Christ and in His Church has never wavered. I am more grateful to God with each passing day. As I look back on my childhood and upbringing, it is clear to me that our Lord was reaching out to me in a number of ways, even though I was not aware of this at the time. My parents were not both Jewish, and their own religious backgrounds were starkly different. My father was Jewish. At one point, when he was preparing for his bar mitzvah, he considered becoming a rabbi. After his youngest sister passed away, his interests shifted to becoming a medical doctor. Most of my dad's family were what we call conservative Jews. Judaism in the United States has a rich history. Historically, what we call Orthodox Judaism was just Judaism. It's basically all there was. The Reform Jewish movement that began in Germany became popular in the United States as well. Our family mostly attended conservative Jewish synagogues. The conservative Jewish movement was actually a response to Reform Judaism, desiring to retain more of the traditions in Hebrew language at synagogue than the Reform movement, even if not as much as within Orthodox Judaism. My dad's grandfather was a staunch Zionist. Zionists were committed to the state of Israel as a Jewish homeland. It can be helpful to think of Zionism as a sort of secular messianism, as one of my old professors of Jewish studies, Thomas Edinopoulos, used to say. In contrast to some among the Orthodox who believe God will regather Israel around Jerusalem when the Messiah comes, Zionists argued that God would not send the Messiah until the land of Israel was retaken by the Jewish people, and they worked the land again. Although my father grew up in a Jewish home, my mother wasn't raised religious at all. Her mom was from a Presbyterian family, but wasn't much of a churchgoer. My mother's father came from a religiously mixed family, but also wasn't religious himself. His father had abandoned Mormonism, and his mother, who had grown up Lutheran, became a Christian Scientist. Early on in his studies, my grandfather was drawn to logical positivist philosophy. This is the sort of philosophy sometimes denounced in more religious circles as rationalism. Positivism combined the related philosophical approaches of rationalism and empiricism. Reason and mathematical proofs were what mattered most. The study of Darwinian evolution provided my grandfather with a rational account of creation. My mother's father would prove to be one of the dominant intellectual influences on me. I was not raised in a religious home during my earliest years. Before my parents divorced, we attended a Unitarian Universalist service for about 2 years, where we children learned about Greek mythology. I'm not sure what the adults learned. The only prayers we had in the home were the basic Hebrew prayers my non-Jewish mother taught us, as when we lit the candles for Hanukkah. There was no mention of God, as far as I can remember. except when we visited family and friends for Passover Seders or other Jewish celebrations. I attended public school until graduate school, but it wasn't until about the 3rd grade that I learned that Christmas commemorated Jesus' birth. And I didn't know that Easter had anything to do with Jesus at all until I was almost 19 years old during the first semester of college. My first few years after my parents separated, I lived with my mother and stepfather. My stepfather, Kurt Banks, had been a professor of psychology at Princeton University, and as a graduate student was involved in the now famous Stanford Prison Study. He shared many intellectual influences with my mother's father, especially Darwin. Both my stepfather and my maternal grandfather played a role in shaping my own religious skepticism. We lived in a very rough school about 2 years from my middle school. I ended up learning martial arts in order to defend myself from the kids at school, and this exposed me a little to East Asian religious and philosophical traditions. I remember asking my grandfather, my mother's father, about the existence of God, not long before this time. I looked up to my grandfather as one of the smartest people I knew. I remember classmates at school talking about God, and I wanted to know what he thought. I asked him, "Grandpa, does God exist?" He responded with a question. "Well, Jeffrey, can you see God?" I responded, "No." He followed this with another question. "Can you hear God?" My answer was the same, "No." He continued with a predictable series of questions, to each of which I responded with the same answer. "Can you feel God?" "No." "Can you smell God?" "No." "Can you taste God?" "No." He drew a conclusion without stating it explicitly, trying to lead me where he saw the logic pointing. He finished the conversation by saying, "Well, I think you found your answer." For my 9-year-old self, this seemed like such a logical response. I did not yet have enough experience with philosophy to see the flaws in my grandfather's implied argument. The implications of his logic, what seemed airtight to me at the time, were self-refuting. His assumption was that philosophical ideas so often assumed in our educational systems that only that which is verifiable directly relying upon one or more of the 5 senses is real or true. Of course, this idea, this very notion itself, was not verifiable directly, relying upon one or more of the 5 senses. Throughout my childhood, I always enjoyed listening to my grandfather as he explained evolution or rationalism, which to him were positive expressions of how we could combat the ills religions caused people. He saw our organized religion, as he put it, as more dangerous than desirable. He thought it kept people in ignorance and did far more harm than good. He provided me my own copies of works by Charles Darwin or Harvard evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould, among others. I began reading these books, which I only understood partly at the time, in the 5th grade. At the same time that I was filling my mind with such ideas, I was trying to survive the frightening realities of a middle school rife with gang violence. A number of my classmates died young or ended up in juvenile detention centers, or later in prison. Taking off for the Jewish holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur made me stand out, and I found myself proud of my Jewish heritage. It provided me a social identity, and it was one thing I shared in common with my closest friends from my old school, whom I visited when I stayed with my dad. Passover became my favorite religious celebration. I had celebrated Christmas, but there was no church, no mention of Jesus, no prayers. Christmas amounted to wintry cartoons, Santa Claus, visits to family, and a lot of presents. It was really only my family's Jewish celebrations that exposed me to the Bible and to any discussion of God. I remember quite vividly a Passover we celebrated at my best friend's house while my parents were still together, and we watched the cup left out for the prophet Elijah fixatedly. The prophet Malachi wrote in Malachi 4, chapter 4, verses 5 through 6, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the land with a curse. As Christians, we understand this as referring to St. John the Baptist. But within Judaism, the tradition remained that Elijah would return before the Messiah came. And these messianic traditions over time became connected with the celebration of Passover. As much as Passover commemorated when God saved his people, Israel, from Egyptian slavery through the Exodus, it came to be associated with when God would again redeem his people with the coming of the Messiah. That's the reason for the famous Jewish tradition at the end of every Passover celebration, where we not only recite the words, "It is finished," but add in the final invocation, "Next year in Jerusalem." The idea being, would that the Messiah would come and we would all be gathered next year in Jerusalem around the Messiah in the Messianic age. By 7th grade, it was decided that the school situation was so bad that my brother and I would live with my father from that point forward. The home was more Jewish than I had thus far experienced, especially after my father married my Jewish stepmother. And we were raised with my 2 Jewish step-siblings. All of my close friends were Jewish, and they were having their bar and bat mitzvahs. I decided that I too wanted a bar mitzvah, but I had not attended the years of Hebrew school my friends had. I ended up having private Hebrew tutoring to prepare me, and then I attended Hebrew school after school in preparation for a late bar mitzvah, which I shared with my stepbrother when he was 13. It was also during the same period that I fell in love with the study of evolution and of primatology, the study of monkeys and apes, which is what I decided to enter college in order to study. During Hebrew school, we studied mostly Jewish ethical debates. Our main textbook was Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the ancient rabbis on ethical matters. My bar mitzvah preparation focused mostly on the pronunciation of Hebrew, learning by heart the specific prayers we would pray, and also reading Jewish commentaries on the portions of the Torah that we would be reading so that we could come up with our own sermon of sorts. The bar mitzvah was historically meant to signify that one could be called upon to read from the Torah and make some comment like a sermon. This is part of the context for understanding what Jesus does in Luke chapter 4, verses 14 to 21, when Jesus reads from the prophet Isaiah in a synagogue and then declares the scripture to be fulfilled as his commentary. The synagogue I attended became Reconstructionist. Reconstructionist Judaism was a movement that began within conservative Judaism, and like Reform Judaism, focused more on a developmental, progressive, or evolutionary aspect to Judaism. Outsiders might view Reform Judaism as a way of assimilating and a protection against anti-Semitism. By watering down the differences between Jews and Gentiles, some outsiders might see the Reform movement as making Judaism less distinctive and thus a form of protection from anti-Semitism. The Reform movement understood itself more as emerging from a different understanding of the Talmud than Orthodox Judaism. The Talmud is a collection of rabbinic interpretation of the Torah. Historically, the Orthodox understood the Talmud as the oral Torah that Moses received instructions from God, which he wrote in the Torah and which he passed along orally, that was later written down by the rabbis in the Talmud. Reform Judaism would argue instead that the Talmud was an adaptation of the Torah to the later changed cultural context of the rabbis. Thus, the Reform movement saw itself as something similar, an adaptation to the new cultural demands of the time. The Reconstructionist movement, even though emerging from conservative Judaism, which itself came from Reform Judaism, focused on this ever-changing development. Thus, for my synagogue, it was not a problem for me to have a bar mitzvah, even though my mother was not Jewish. This would ordinarily be a problem, since for quite some time you're only considered Jewish if your mother is Jewish, or if you formally convert. Although we often consider the bar mitzvah a coming-of-age ritual, after which a Jewish boy joins the adult men at the synagogue wearing the prayer shawl, a talis or talit. My first real experience of adult independence coincided with my first real experience observing Catholicism, when I spent the summer before my senior year of high school as a volunteer health worker in the mountains of rural Honduras. I lived with a poor Catholic family in a one-room house without electricity and only a dirt floor. I built latrines for poor families in the mountains. The average income was about $50 each year. The cost of supplies for each latrine amounted to more than the average family made annually. There were 11 of us in that one-room house. We bathed in the local river. Although I don't remember any distinct Catholic practices the family had, we did hitchhike to the closest Catholic church, about an hour away every few weeks, to attend Sunday Mass. I felt completely lost at Mass, even though I understood Spanish fairly well and could follow the homily. I didn't feel comfortable participating in what I felt was a foreign religious service. Had I been Jewish, I would have been more comfortable, even though I was an agnostic. The family reassured me that, in fact, I was not permitted to receive communion. This actually brought me comfort. I was struck by how few people actually received the Eucharist, although I didn't have any idea whatsoever about what the Eucharist was or why so few were receiving it. I listened attentively to the homily, but I did so with highly skeptical ears. I can still recall the priest preaching about how important it was for the people to pray to God, for the crops that they farmed, and for any of their financial needs. To me, the priest seemed well-dressed compared to the people. And I remember thinking that the priest was a charlatan, manipulating the people's ignorance. I didn't know where his money came from, but I looked at the people around in their Sunday best, and even that was a pretty sad sight. The family I stayed with had 2 pairs of clothes, their daily clothes, dirty, full of holes, which they lived and worked in each day. The other pair were their Sunday clothes, which, although a bit fancier and somewhat less worn, were still dirty and in far worse condition than what I was accustomed to wear at home back in the US. Another significant moment from my trip to Central America was when I got really sick. I suffered a mild sickness that most of us Americans had while visiting Honduras. But one day, I became really sick, so sick I thought I might die. I was in so much pain. I later discovered I had both Giardia and E. coli at the same time. Not something I will remember fondly, and I'll spare you the details. But it was during this affliction that I remember praying my first real prayer, even though it was somewhat the prayer of a skeptic. I said something like, "God, if there is a God, please bring me healing and comfort." Those weren't the exact words, but it was something like that. My father, being a physician, had given me some powerful antibiotics in advance, just in case I got something like this, and they worked. Needless to say, I forgot about my prayer. And even had I remembered, I wouldn't have thought to thank God. I wouldn't even have attributed any healing or comfort to God. My image of God was a false one. I didn't have any good religious formation. Like so many we encounter, whether they were raised Catholic or Protestant, Christian or Jewish, or anything else. I thought if God exists, he must only work through clear miracles that could not be attributed to anything other than divine intervention. As with so many skeptics, I thought God could only work in and through our lives by working outside of what we consider normal and ordinary. I never thought that God could actually work through the ordinary, that we often cooperate with God, and that we can become an answer to prayer for someone else, even when we do ordinary, everyday things. This idea of God working through the ordinary is something Christianity has always taught. When I returned back to the US and began my senior year of high school, another event happened that I should probably mention. I was early for math class one day, and I pulled out a book to read. I noticed another student who had also arrived early. He was reading a book too. Curious, I asked him what he was reading. It was a book of Christian apologetics, arguing that the Bible was historically reliable. I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard at that point. I didn't quite laugh in his face, but my reaction was probably just as bad as if I had. I later met him again in college after I had become a Christian myself. and I had thrown myself headlong into the world of Christian apologetics, the rational defense of the faith. In the next lecture, I'll explain the details of my conversion, and you'll see as you accompany me along that journey how much of it is taken up with the rational defense of Christianity, which is what apologetics is all about. A large portion of my journey to Christ and to the Catholic Church involved my own investigations into the historical reliability of the Bible. What I discovered was that the basic thrust of the book my classmate was reading, which I ridiculed at the time, was actually true. The Bible is historically reliable. In fact, it's the most historically reliable document or collection of documents from ancient history. This will be the context for the main content of this lecture series on Jesus' resurrection. Jesus' resurrection is the best explanation for the historical facts concerning his death, burial, the empty tomb, and the eyewitnesses to the resurrection. But those four historical data points are intimately bound up with the question of the Bible's historical trustworthiness. I begin this series of lectures with my own journey because the resurrection is not merely a historical event. In fact, in some ways, it's not historical at all. There were no eyewitnesses to the event of the resurrection itself, only to Jesus' resurrected body after the actual resurrection. There are not even written accounts of Jesus' actual resurrection. The Gospels tell us of the empty tomb and of the risen Lord appearing to others after the resurrection. The resurrection did happen, and it did happen in real history, in real life. But it is truly transhistorical. More to the point, for each of us, the resurrection must take on a personal character. Jesus' resurrection is not merely an idea to be believed, but an event to be lived. Jesus is real. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He wants to be our friend, and he is the lover of our souls. Fundamentally, at its root, Jesus' resurrection is about his love for us. It's about how he wants to enter our lives. This is the story of how he entered my life.